Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Wardrobe vidcast with me, Don Bryan. This episode, episode 2, we're going to be looking at work. What is it and why do we do it? But first, I'd like to thank those who commented on the first video. I appreciate that. Comments are very useful. And in particular, I'd like to thank Joseph Bilden for his comment where he raised an alternative to UBI as being universal basic assets. And I hope to expand on this, discuss this further as why that might be a potentially better solution to UBI in a following video. But in this video, as mentioned, I'm going to be looking at work, various elements of work. And I want to break it down into 3 topic areas. And the first half of the video, I'm going to discuss those topics and questions relating to those topics. And in the second half of the video, I'm going to hopefully answer those questions with what I feel to be the pertinent points, pertinent answers to those questions, and also be referencing some what I believe to be important texts and interesting texts on the subject. And I'll also be including in the description time codes or links that you'll be able to jump to the various sections of the video, because it might be quite a long video this. We'll see. So without further ado, let's start with the first topic, which is why is it important to work? So let's set aside the economic necessity to work to sustain ourselves for a moment and explore whether it is something other than money that in this age drives us to work, whatever that work may be. So to answer this, I feel it might be useful to address other components or notions that fall alongside this question, why is it important to work, such as what do we mean by work when we say it today in the developed Western world, for example. So I say that this because I think the geographic element is deterministic, as work in a poor, undeveloped region of the world will have a different context and meaning to the developed world, largely because of the options and ability to determine your own work life are not as plentiful. So you have less options to define how you might want to work to sustain yourself. So I would suggest that the function and purpose of work has changed over time since we have, as a society, moved away from predominantly agrarian activity, such as livestock farming and production of crops, and moved into the industrial and manufacturing age, and then again into the current era of activity, which might be defined as a service industry age and the financialization age, amongst other continuations from previous eras, such as the technological age. I think we can say without argument that though through the passage of time since the agrarian age, the working populace has to a decreasing extent been engaged in working activity that has had the sole purpose of producing what we could call necessities: food, materials, clothing, medicines, things essential to support life. So within the materials, you could have building materials, building shelter, for materials for making implements to cook with, so on and so on. So the production of materials could be expanded out to be a much broader category. So would it be fair to say that what the word work meant in that age, in a practical descriptive sense, but also in an emotional or psychological sense, would be different than today? So obviously this is a generalization, as some percentage of the population today who are, still engaged in agriculture and other necessity-based production. They were very real. Also, there were very real and impactful social and economic inequities put upon the, common working citizen of the agrarian age, which would have shaped the experience of living through that age to some degree, and certainly would have shaped their experience of work. But I don't want to go into that particular discussion. I want to examine if we can describe the differences from that time to the present in the experience of work that comes from the nature of the work itself. So essentially I'm asking the question, is it important for work to be recognised by the worker as being necessary and useful? Do we need to feel these qualities on a human level to increase the positive experience of work, the engagement of work? And what are the consequences, if any, if we don't? So, if we don't experience a sense of purpose and feel like we're taking part in something that's necessary as part of our work, what are the consequences of that? So when we feel our work is unnecessary and inconsequential, and we don't feel a sense of engagement in that sense with it. So later on in this episode, I'm going to reference the work of David Graeber, who is an anthropologist from the London School of Economics, famous for several books, but I would suggest most notably and most relevant to this discussion, certainly, is his 2018 work, Bullshit Jobs, A Theory. So in this book, Graeber attempts to answer the questions of our own evaluation of the usefulness of the work we do and how that affects us. So that is the first topic, if you will. Okay, so section B, or second topic, is work just for the poor? Okay, so I want to discuss the attitudes we have as a society towards those who don't work for differing reasons, and whether those attitudes have changed over time, and does status also play a part in that? In particular, do we disproportionately look negatively upon those who are financially poor and don't work over those who are wealthy and don't work? Are there other reasons to view that situation negatively, beyond the obvious sustainability issues of someone without work and no financial resources? Do we attach other assumptions and judgments other than purely a lack of money to people in that situation? If we see people in that situation as being a burden on society financially, and those with the appearance and assets of wealth who don't work as not being a burden in the same way, are we actually seeing things accurately? Are there opportunities to extract wealth and therefore burden the public purse when you have financial assets and other assets such as real estate? So the Duke of Westminster might be a case in point. Essentially, do we really believe in the notion of a collective economy that requires input from all to work for and provide for all? Is this an accurate picture of the system we live in, and where does this notion come from? So again, I will try to answer and offer some answers to these questions and thoughts at the end of the video, in the second part of the video. So this is the last topic area. I've done my work, give me my money. So in this last part of the topic sections, I want to pose some questions about money being our only frame of reference for work-based activities. Are we culturally conditioned to reference all activity and productivity against economic benefit or gain? And any watching this who have tried to plough out an existence in the creative arts will be scratching their heads and wondering what I'm going on about. Am I actually supposed to get money? So an obvious statement to make, I guess. Of course, we are conditioned that way. That's how we acquire money to survive in our developed world economy. I suppose what I'm trying to reflect on here is the possibility that we have through a kind of tunnel vision, neglected to look at the other opportunities that this mode of thinking hides. Or could it be said that because of our cultural fixation on money as a universal reference point, have we become less cooperative, less productive, less imaginative, and less pragmatic? Are there other modes of activity and other forms of transaction we could switch into if we were less restricted by a single form of reward for work? Okay, so right, that's enough with the questions. I'll try and address some of the questions I've raised and give some more context and historical footing to the various points discussed in the next part of this video, the answers. Well, I haven't got the answers, certainly not all of them, but maybe we can explore things a little bit further and continue the discussion. So I'm presenting the views here as a challenge to what I believe is our all too often uncritical acceptance of our existing working culture. Can we change that? And I'm going to try and tackle things in the order they were presented in the first half. So let's try and add some perspectives and thoughts that exist out there already in the world to the ideas raised in the first part or the first section, in which I posed the question, why is it important to work? Now, the point of this particular videocast is to take the starting place that is universally accepted, that you have to work, that's just the way it is, and challenge the ideas and beliefs behind that, if at all possible. I also mentioned I'd be referencing David Graeber, and in particular his work, Bullshit Jobs, a Theory. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to mention at this point, at the time of this recording of this video, in the last couple of days, the sad news has come about that David Graeber has passed away at the age of 59. And I only hope that I can faithfully represent the views and intentions and the spirit behind his work in this video. So Bullshit Jobs, a Theory, I think is a good entry point into the landscape that is the modern workplace, and how much of the work or job roles that occupy that landscape are or are not necessary and effective to our modern society. Now, I'm certainly not going to challenge the idea that all work is unnecessary or avoidable. Okay, so what does David Graeber mean when he says bullshit jobs? To quote the author, a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. Now, Graeber goes on to describe 5 types of entirely pointless job, which I will list. Now, I did take issue with some of the terminology used here, and I think it was a case of maybe a kind of transatlantic loss in translation, so I wasn't completely sure of what he meant by the particular terms he used for these 5 types of pointless jobs, but I will list them nonetheless with my slight reinterpretation of his or my interpretation of his terminology. So at number 1, we have flunkies, or I would suggest dog's body, who serve only to make their superiors feel important. Number 2, goons or bullies, who oppose others of the same ilk hired by other companies. Number 3, duct tapers, who temporarily fix problems that could be fixed permanently. Number 4, something we're all probably familiar with, box tickers, who create the appearance that something is useful or something useful is being done when it isn't. And lastly, number 5, taskmasters, who manage or create extra work for those who don't need it. So what is the genesis of these job roles? Why have they come into being if they appear to offer no fundamental or necessary use? So before we answer that question, can we put a number on the people on the people who are engaged in what Graeber would categorise as bullshit jobs? Well, according to a YouGov poll that was conducted near the time of the publication of the work in question, 37% of people in the UK asserted that they felt their jobs are meaningless, and in Holland that figure was 40%. So we're talking about quite a sizable chunk of the working population here, and the figure could be conceivably higher in reality. Obviously, we still also have an arguable majority who don't feel that they fit into this category, and although they may not enjoy their work, they see it as, to some degree, purposeful. Now, our basic needs have not changed since the agrarian age mentioned in the first part of this video. And so we still need people to fulfill those roles. But as Graeber argues, and as other great luminaries from our recent history envisioned, do we need to be working as much as we do to meet these needs? Now, I'll be looking at this issue a little more later in the video. So I feel it's important here to return to the question of the experience and relationship to work and how that might have changed over time. In pre-industrial times, it certainly could be said that as an individual, your options regards work and labour were very much dictated by social strata and class, and as a result, very profound social inequities were in place. With the coming age of industrialisation and the mechanisation of some labour, there was also a sense of fear and trepidation amongst pretty much all who might be affected, who are not the minority of financially independent secure, that the opportunity to earn a subsistence would be taken from them by this mechanisation. I'm mentioning this as a kind of aside because I think we may be approaching a similar dilemma in our own world today with a new level of automation courtesy of AI. But again, I'm not going to go into that here because it's not the purpose of this video and simply don't have time. Also, I don't want to dig too deep into the history of pre-industrial times and the transition into the industrial age and all the factors that would have shaped the average citizen's working life. So having asked the question about the experience of work and how that is shaped by the nature of the work, I think it would be somewhat of a challenge to clearly evidence in any kind of measurable way a sort of happiness to work ratio for a particular type of work, and how that was in pre-industrial times and how that is now. This, I would say, is due mainly to the lack of documents written by the common worker in those times, so in the pre-industrial times when the illiteracy rates were very high in that group. So it's hard to get a picture of their relationship to their working lives for the common citizen, that is. Now we can say, I would argue, that the function of job roles, almost without exception, had the collective aim of producing tangible products for consumption in these times as opposed to now. Again, putting aside in general the fact that workers didn't own the means of production or the profit from its output, there was still the real connection to the fruits of labour. So again, I'm returning to the idea now of the work experience. So how the nature of work, the nature of the work itself, impacts on the experience of the worker. Also, in those times, there was very little need for administration and not much obligation towards different forms of compliance, such as health and safety, that we have today. What does our own experience tell us about the way we feel when we create something of use for ourselves? I think we've all experienced satisfaction in that way when we create something useful or we complete a practical task that benefits us and our lives. So what I would suggest is that in this present era, job satisfaction has been used to leverage down the pay of certain job sectors, exploiting the weighting of value within types of groupings of people, and that has kept the pay packet as low as possible. So that's, to put it another way, that would be to say that people's quest or search for a meaningful job role, particularly, for example, in caregiving, has been used to leverage down their pay because the fact that they're getting a reward, a kind of emotional or reward other than monetary from the job. So again, I will let you fill in the blanks on the one that on who the victims might be in that particular mechanism of weighting job pay. So what is the lay of the land with regards to job satisfaction now? Well, a national wellbeing survey published by the Office of National Statistics in 2012 demonstrated that the job sectors of agriculture, forestry and fishing were the happiest and most satisfied of all. So it would seem that the common elements of nature and the fruits of labour are deterministic in our happiest workers today. Okay, so let's return to the evolution of the self-proclaiming pointlessly employed. So where do these jobs exist and how did they evolve? Again, Graeber argues that these jobs are largely in the private sector, despite the fact that market competition would root out such inefficiencies, or should do theoretically, which is one of the central principles or operational facets of market capitalism. In companies, he concludes that the rise of service sector jobs owes less to economic need than to managerial feudalism, in which employees need underlings to feel important and maintain competitive status and power. So Graeber is certainly arguing here that it is not out of necessity or efficiency at large within the working culture of the developed world that these job roles have developed, more an ego-based desire or compulsion amongst the managerial class to further enhance their work experience and status. So Graeber is inferring that with the gradual but pronounced transition of the capitalist system from one predominantly production-based to the incumbent system now, which is predominantly financial capital-based, a superfluous void of meaningless jobs has been created in the image of the most powerful within the present economic system. Capitalism, as we experience it today, is paradoxically creating the space for jobs that seemingly have no useful and productive function, in contrary to the one of the central tenets for the ideological base of capitalism: inefficiencies don't survive. In addition to this, Graeber suggests a genuine disdain has developed in society by those who recognise at some level the relative lack of usefulness of their own job role toward those who have productive and somewhat meaningful job roles. One element of this that is practically demonstrated is the attempt to publicly shame transport workers, as an example, when they are performing strike actions for better pay and conditions. Now, the fact that the strike action causes disruption is in itself the indicator of the usefulness of a job. All the while, the relative bloated salaries of desk-bound managerial class are free from public scrutiny or scorn. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the job satisfaction inherent from the usefulness of a job is used as part payment for the job itself. You can't have a useful job and be well paid. That would make sense, or that wouldn't make sense. Okay, so putting Graeber aside for a moment, what is the other evidence for this paradox within our working lives today? So let's take a look at this issue from a different angle. Let's get a view which describes a more technical and mechanistic evolution of how the labour experience has been shaped. Harry Braverman, an American metalsmith worker turned political activist and then author, wrote the seminal book Labour and Monopoly Capital: The Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, published in 1974. A book which arguably defined the emerging field of labour process studies and revitalised academic sociology's interest in the history and operation of the workplace. Braverman's key argument or issue with the experience of modern labour was how it was controlled through stripping out autonomy regards decision-making and creativity from the particular tasks of work and placing those in the hands of managers and supervisors. He described this particular hierarchy as the maintenance crew for the human machinery. Repetitive, simple actions achieve more doing time and reduce thinking time. This process, he argued, contributed to the gradual de-skilling of the labour force and the rise of a seemingly unproductive managerial class. But seeing it in the interests of the owners of capital, essentially company owners and employers, the necessity for this evolution would be the increased profit this arrangement brings to the process of production. The additional positive elements to the owners of production regards a de-skilled workforce is the leverage over the worker the particular company or method of production has. You become less able to transfer your labour to another setting and therefore become more dependent on your current one. Braverman wrote this book in a time before the rise of service industry to the level it is today and the subsequent decline of manufacturing that we also have seen today. And so it could be said, how could he account for the labour force of today and some of the so-called roles that Graeber refers to? Well, Braverman constructed a theory or model which he saw as reflecting the world he experienced. This model he called the universal market, and it describes the ultimate goal of capitalism being to encapsulate all activity, from work to leisure, and commodify it. This is a description by Chris Rojek of Braverman's universal market. Leisure activity is part of the universal market of capitalism. The universal market means a web of commodified goods, services and amusements which eliminates any possibility of escape. Braverman identifies 3 stages in the development of the universal market. The first stage consists of the replacement of domestic or barter systems of production within their commodity form. The second stage involves a conversion of services based upon personal or local trust relations into commodified services and amusements. The third stage is a product cycle in which new goods, services and amusements are endlessly paraded before the consumers so that they create a dependency culture. That is, people feel that they cannot live without them. So a key element we can extract from this model is the creation of a dependency culture, I believe. One in which we are offered that we don't necessarily need. I think we recognise the extent to which this model is accurate, and so I would say it is not unrealistic to assume how inevitable it is in a pure commodification sense that this process will require job surfacing the artificial needs, therefore bullshit jobs. Let's leave behind the arguments and theories for the rise of pointless work and look in more detail at the effects of pointless work and our relationship to it. What is the psychological impact on the worker engaged in a job they see as meaningless? Graeber describes the predicament of being knowingly engaged in a meaningless job as profound psychological violence, a scar across our collective soul. So, what is the evidence for this and how we engage with the ideas of unhappiness due to our job role? Now, Gallup consulted employees in a survey during the years 2011 to 2012. The results were not that encouraging. Only 13% of people were engaged in their work, 63% of people were not engaged, and 24% of them were actively disengaging with their work. In other words, 13% found their work meaningful and pleasing, 63% disliked their work and endured it dispassionately, 24% simply hated their jobs. So that's roughly 87% of employees had a negative experience of their work or job role. They didn't find their jobs meaningful, they didn't feel valued, or that they belonged. Now, Gallup isn't the only source reporting equivalent results. The O.C. Tanner Institute interviewed 2,500 employees in 2015. The survey covered Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and Germany, and only one question was asked. Are you appreciated in your workplace? In places where the employees were appreciated, 85% of employees were happy about their life in general and 89% were happy with their work. Also, 78% of them told that they had a sense of belonging at their work. However, in the places where employees weren't appreciated, 61% of the employees were happy about their life in general and only 51% were happy with their work. Disturbingly, only 35% said they had a sense of belonging. 43% also signalled that negative feelings leading to profound depression as a result of not being appreciated. I'm going to link a video from Johann Hari at the end of this video, as I think his analysis on the causes of societal depression and anxiety and how in part that relates to our work culture is brilliantly insightful and born out of his own quest to resolve his personal mental health issues. He advocates, he's written a couple of books and advocates strongly for non-pharmaceutical therapies and solutions to depression and anxiety. It's well worth checking out. Is work just for the poor? Okay, so in the questions part of the video, I raised the idea that attitudes and beliefs regards work, which is as a necessity or a necessary means to earn money, haven't always been the same and have certainly been viewed differently by different segments of society. So let's go further into this. And I think this is an interesting reflection on how society and class structures have changed their opinions and the conditioning towards the notion of work. Now, William Petty, the 17th century economist and philosopher, who certainly wasn't in isolation in his view, referred to those without the vote or education, essentially the working class, as the poor people, the vile and brutish part of mankind. Across the Channel in France, Voltaire, the iconic writer and philosopher, had this to say on the people doomed to work. By people, I mean the populace that only has its hands to work with. I doubt that class of citizens will ever have time or capacity for education. As to the people, they will always be stupid and barbarous. So in some respects, you could say he wasn't very much of a people person. Now, there are any numbers of writings we could pick upon describing the educated elite of the 17th to 19th century era's notion of who should work and why things are that way. And obviously there's less recorded commentary from the lower strata of society for reasons in the main of literacy. To me, what becomes clear reading these descriptions of the ethos of the pre-industrial era is the distinct absence in our society today, at arguably all class levels, of the notion of how work is a curse of class and befalls only, essentially, the less well-bred. The pursuit of intellectual enlightenment was seen as noble by contrast to today, where we could swap that out with work. This is an extract from Herbert Applebaum's Concept of Work, the Ancient, Medieval and Modern, describing the period in question. At the time, the average young English gentleman was educated to have a disdain for physical labour, trade and commerce. By way of contrast, Locke, which would be John Locke, the 17th century theologian and Protestant, stressed mental and manual labour, the practical and useful industry, perseverance, enterprise, thrift and sobriety. The gulf separating the two outlooks was basically between a traditional noble class ethic and a modern work ethic, each involving a different notion of the meaning of rational conduct. Now, Graeber echoes these sentiments and specifically credits John Locke as a pivotal figure in the arrival of a new moral landscape regards work, the Puritan work ethic, which can also be grouped with the Protestant work ethic, is central, both of which are central to Locke's belief of the virtue of work. So what are the origins of that? The Protestant work ethic arguably evolved from the teachings of Martin Luther in the 16th century. The biblical idea of good works, actions, was transformed into work as duty to benefit oneself and society, and will see you into the favour of God. Also in the 16th century, Calvinism, originating from Jean Calvin, a French-born theologian, was another breakaway Christian order of the Reformation period with its roots in Switzerland. It also promoted a strong work ethic as virtuous and desirable for anyone wishing to be amongst God's chosen, marked for redemption. So work became noble. Both these religious movements swept across Europe and to the shores of Britain to influence the likes of John Locke, who would then carry these ideals, amongst others, across to the new colony of America. Now, sociologists and political scientists have argued that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dogma has sustained and propelled the term Protestant work ethic as part of the myths used to assert racial dominance and class culture. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we have deluded ourselves into believing that the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of a Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves, and it continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, here and abroad. So it could be said, as Graeber argues, that once the emerging and now dominant Protestant work ethic has, by way of a cultural universally accepted norm, prevented the general worker from reaping advances in productivity as a reduced workday. We have come to believe that work determines our self-worth, even if we find that work pointless. Okay, so we've looked at the attitudes to work and how they have changed through time. What then of how we regard work ethic or unemployment through the lens of wealth as a culture today? Do we stigmatise according to the lack of wealth of the subject in question? So do we stigmatise those who don't have work and don't have wealth unfairly? I want to include extracts here from a Guardian article of October 2018 written by Brooke Harrington, a professor of economic sociology at the Copenhagen Business School, which looks to some degree at this question. Professor Harrington spent 10 years on and off interviewing the wealth managers of what we now familiarly term the 1%. The picture that emerged from these dialogues is one of social strata that engages in what the rest of society might characterise as distinctly unusual or atypical behaviours that the strata in question considers normal. For example, one financial management professional said, "I've told my colleagues, if I ever become like some of our clients, shoot me, because they are really immoral people, too much time on their hands, and all the money means they have no limits." The clients of this Geneva-based wealth manager also believe that they are descended from the pharaohs and that they were destined to inherit the earth. Now, as the author of the article points out, for a poor individual to say such a thing in our society, it would potentially attract the attention of mental health professionals. Professor Harrington also notes that not only discretion but a workaday acceptance of the promiscuities and individual and family-based behavioural dynamics is of equal importance to the wealthy clients as any technical aptitude toward financial management. Many of the clients of the wealth managers interviewed did not work but lived off inherited assets. The author goes on to comment, "Behaviours indulged in the rich are not just condemned in the poor but used as justification to punish them, denying them access to resources that keep them alive. These disparate perceptions aren't just evidence of hypocrisy, they are literally a matter of life and death. In the US, the widespread belief that the poor are simply lazy has led many states to impose work requirements on aid recipients, even those who have been medically classified as disabled. Limiting aid programs in this way has been shown to shorten recipients' lives, rather than the intended consequence of pushing recipients into paid employment. The restrictions have simply left them without access to medical care or a sufficient food supply." Now, on a particular issue of government programmes and the ideologies and beliefs behind their inception, in the UK, it could be said that a similar stance has been taken as with the US, as just described. This is an extract from Professor Philip Alston's report from November 2018. He was a United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, and this was after visiting the UK. British compassion for those who are suffering has been replaced by a punitive, mean-spirited and often callous approach, apparently designed to instill discipline where it is least useful, to impose a rigid order on the lives of those least capable of coping with today's world, and elevating the goal of enforcing blind compliance over a genuine concern to improve the well-being of those at the lowest levels of British society. It can be said fairly, I believe, that stigma and judgments applied to the poorer strata of society for particular behaviours are not equally applied to the wealthiest for the same set of behaviours. Okay, so let's move on to the question of burden on society in terms of support taken financially versus contributions made. So in the UK, with its relative substantial welfare system, the data and arithmetic would suggest on paper that the wealthiest raise a considerable amount of tax revenue and will take little or nothing in terms of direct benefits from the government. Obviously, the unemployed and financially poor will be extracting wealth from the taxpayer-supported government funds, whilst providing nothing or near to nothing in terms of income tax, but are not entirely free from taxation. But are the richest being taxed as proportionately to their wealth as those lower down the ladder? Let's return to the US for a moment to see how different income brackets share the tax burden there. Now, these figures are from the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy in the US as of 2015. Overall, the poorest 20% of Americans paid an average of 10.9% of their income in state and local taxes. The middle 20% of Americans paid 9.4%. The top 1%, meanwhile, pay only 5.4% of their income to state and local taxes. There isn't much in the way of a welfare system for the unemployed in the US, and many don't claim it because of the bureaucratic challenges it presents and other restrictions. So arguably in America, it could be said that the poorest in society shoulder the biggest burden, proportionately to their income, for the services and infrastructure that the government provides. What about the UK? So in the UK, we progressively tax earned income. We progressively tax earned income as income received through the pay-as-you-earn system at a comparatively high rate on the international stage for those who are the highest earners. For the year 2016-17, we paid £174 billion in income tax. Now, of that, £52.5 billion, nearly a third of all tax raised, was paid by the 381,000 taxpayers who earn more than £150,000 a year. The tax paid by those 381,000 individuals was more than all the income tax paid by the first 20 million taxpayers. But still, for many of the richest, when looking at their wealth as a whole, the tax on earned income does not detract or subtract from their wealth as proportionately as it would from individuals who would be considered to be much less wealthy. To put it another way, in this country, the UK, as with many other developed nations, there is no direct tax on wealth, just income, and there are legal mechanisms at anyone's disposal through which wealth can transit on with tax impunity. The trust fund. The current Duke of Westminster makes a prominent example. So does that matter? Well, does having large amounts of capital at your disposal and such apparatus as the trust fund give an advantage that is not within reach of the financially bereft? Can wealth present a net burden to the taxpayer? As Grace Blakeley argues, a British economics and politics commentator, author and former columnist for the New Statesman, the best way to become a billionaire in the UK is not through wealth creation, but extraction. Most British billionaires have made their wealth by extracting economic rents from the production process, by monopolising a scarce resource, be that property, commodities or intellectual property, and overcharging others for its use. Not the activity model that is so often presented, the millionaire or billionaire business owner creating and investing in jobs, or the tech entrepreneur likewise. The single largest source of wealth on the Sunday Times Rich list is property. In addition, in the 1980s and beyond, asset stripping was an application of the purchasing power wealth affords to buy companies, enterprises and their assets at a knockdown price and sell off their component parts at a profit. Returning to the Duke of Westminster, the current holder of this title, a Hugh, 29 and from Cheshire, who inherited the £9 billion fortune in 2016, will have avoided paying 40% inheritance tax via the Grosvenor estate being encompassed in a trust fund. Instead of one-off taxation, trusts are subject to charges every 10 years from the anniversary of their creation. This is called the inheritance tax periodic charge and can amount to 6% of the funds held. However, plenty of loopholes such as agricultural and business property relief can be applied, and the Grosvenor assets will have been mandated to take full advantage of that. Will have been managed to take full advantage of that. So due to the diverse and relatively large geographic spread of the real estate assets owned by the Duke of Westminster, it would be fair to assume that in the use of these assets, an accordingly large amount of national infrastructure is needed and used. Does the trust that holds all of these assets pay a comparable amount of tax to support the infrastructure it needs compared to the rest of society? For that reason, could it be said that the rich are a greater burden on society than we are led to believe? If we believe there is such a thing as a collective economy or a working system which requires contribution by all to support us all, what is this based upon? And is it an accurate depiction of the system we experience? Now, the definition of a collective economy as defined by the International Centre for Research and Information on the Collective Economy, meeting in Geneva, October 1954, is as follows. Those undertakings which are institutionally designed directly to promote the welfare of an organised society or of an idea for which this society stands. They devote their individual achievements and or their results to an organised society. A private economy undertaking, unlike a collective economy undertaking, may be considered as a single economic unit, principally designed to serve the individual interests of its owners. The term collective economy may also be used to designate a particular type of cooperation between single economic units in a national economy. Now, I don't have to hand a nicely fitting reference from academic research, expert testimony, or other to answer the questions just raised about our cultural notion of a collective debt of labour to the economic system we experience. But I do feel some of the attitudes and hypocritical stances of judgment have already been uncovered here. Could these be explained by the separation that exists between extreme ends of the social stratas that are defined by wealth and the lack of interaction between those that inhabit these different stratas? Do those of us who occupy the economic stratas in between, the middle ground, have a closer interaction with the people at the bottom end of the spectrum, and so are only able to judge the behaviour we observe, which we deem to be negative? I will leave that for you to decide. Okay, so I want to answer some of the questions posed in the last section of the questions part of this video, then move on to some of my conclusions, and hopefully you will see some of the reasoning behind them. So this is the last part of the video. So firstly, the question of whether we have always had the same relationship or motivation to keep working as long as the money keeps coming. Have we as communities looked at other trade-offs for how we can divide our time? Well, the answer would appear to be yes. This is an extract from The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure by Juliet B. Shaw. During one period of unusually high wages, the late 14th century, many labourers refused to work by the year or the half year or by any of the usual terms, but only by the day. And they worked only as many days as was necessary to earn their customary income, which in this case amounted to about 120 days a year, for a probable total of only 1,440 hours annually. This estimate assumes a 12-hour day because the days worked were probably during spring, summer and fall. Manorial records from 14th century England indicate an extremely short working year, 175 days, for servile labourers. Later evidence for farmer miners, a group with control over their work time, indicates they worked only 180 days a year. So it would appear that over time we have seen the option of periods without paid work removed from our culture. It could obviously be argued that in predominant agrarian culture of the time, work was seasonal, but then again work might have been available elsewhere, such as cottage craft industries and coastal fishing communities. So people could have gone to other work when the agrarian seasonal work had finished. Could it be said, though, that we have lost or are in ignorance of the concept of working only to sustain a lower level of consumption and need in return for free time to spend as we choose? So that was the trade-off mentioned before. should technology have set us free or greatly reduced the burden from work. To return to Graeber once again, Graeber makes reference to a prediction by economist John Maynard Keynes in 1930. The productivity benefits of automation would lead to a 15-hour work week. Clearly, we haven't achieved that. Why? Graeber, Braverman and many others would argue that once we started on the journey to systematically spend our human and production resources on delivering products and spending options that we reasonably could consider to be superfluous to our basic needs, technology has in the main been used and invested in to propel us further in this direction, rather than to free us from labour. This in part is what Braverman was describing in his universal market model. Or to look at it from a different angle, the consumer-based universal market system consumes our time and purpose as fuel to sustain itself. The artificial abundance of output from our current system derives an artificial rate or burden of labour. Graeber identifies this by saying bullshit jobs justify contemporary patterns of living, that the pains of dull work are a suitable justification for the ability to fully fulfill consumer desires, and that fulfilling those desires is indeed the reward for suffering through pointless work. In addition, he argues that the energy and time extracted from well-worked populations depletes the ability to and engagement with the idea. Revolt. Okay, so some conclusions. I want to just summarise what I believe to be the takeaway points from this and welcome any and all responses to the points made. So, firstly, have we been on a journey falsely described as an organic evolution of an industrial, technical, market-based economy since the industrial age, which has artificially allowed for the development of greater demands on labour, rather than a steady direction toward a technologically driven reduction in labour without a loss in living standards? Why hasn't our civilization been collectively drawn toward the latter? Graeber suggests that one of the challenges to confronting our feelings about bullshit jobs is a lack of a behavioural script. There is a genuine awkwardness and unease in confronting those considered to be trapped in that category, and maybe the reasons for it. He also contends bullshit jobs serve political ends, in which political parties are more concerned about having jobs than whether the jobs themselves are fulfilling. So we have a political class unwilling to challenge the status quo. Nothing particularly shocking about that revelation. And culturally, we seem to draw a conceptual blank on any notion of a different way of doing things. Lost in a historical fog, maybe? There are numerous contemporary studies which indicate that people willingly will orientate toward a meaningful job at a lower rate of pay, but there is still so much in-work dissatisfaction within the modern labour force. Why hasn't the appeal of working less exceeded the appeal of riches, like in the above land labourer examples? That might seem like a dumb question, maybe one with an obvious answer, but it is the narratives and paradigms used to support the evolution of our current system of living that are maybe the most important things to examine. How truthful and logical are they, and how much myth is entwined in our perception of our journey to today? Seemingly, we are playing catch-up with our institutional academic investigation into the negative psychological impact of putting monetary reward before the nature of work itself and the time we invest in it, whilst enduring a creeping mental health crisis steadily devouring the developed world. And what of the assertions I made regards our work culture in question? Have we become less cooperative, less productive, less imaginative, and maybe less pragmatic? Well, unfortunately, folks, I have run out of time, so I'm not going to answer those questions right now. But I hope to address these and maybe some remedies in a following video. If you've watched this far, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to any input and commentary you might have. But that's going to do it for now. So stay tuned and bye for now.